Thank you. That was very nice, wasn't it? Okay. At the Ethical Society, we organize our programmatic year around a theme. This year's theme is exploring the human condition. I hope you've enjoyed the diverse platforms these last few months. The platform team is hard at work scheduling dynamic speakers with fascinating topics for us in the coming months as well. Today's platform is the stuff of headlines. Just last week, the Senate Judiciary Committee gave a bipartisan show trial and hammered the heads of Facebook, Meta, TikTok, Snap, and X, relating to the safety of those platforms on young people. Missouri's own Senator Josh Hawley actually got Mark Zuckerberg to apologize. Astonishing, although to give him credit, while it's performative, the senator has been focused on this issue for some time. Our speaker today is a fifth-year doctoral candidate in clinical psychology at Washington University in St. Louis. Her research primarily examines the influence of social media on mental health. As a clinical scientist, she focuses on understanding the clinical implications of social media use, including identifying those at greatest risks for its negative consequences and what people can do to develop healthy social media habits. She hopes her research will guide strategies for clinicians and policy makers alike, and we all hope for that policy maker guidance. Please welcome Allison Tuck.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you as well for the minute of mindfulness. That was really helpful right before having to give a talk, so I really, really appreciate that. My name is Allison Tuck. I use she, her pronouns, and as we heard, I am a clinical psychology doctoral student over at Washington University in St. Louis, and I'm just really excited to be here today and share with you some of what I've been working on these past, 4.5 going on 5 years. And so with that, I'll start off by saying that in science, and especially in psychology, we are interested in knowing the relationships between two things. So how something A may be related to some other thing B. And if we really want to know how thing A is related to thing B, we have to get really, really specific about how we're measuring thing A and thing B. So for example, if we're interested in knowing the relationship between, say, exercise and health, well, how are we measuring exercise? Are we measuring exercise by the amount that someone is on their feet? Are we measuring exercise by the amount that someone is sweating? Are we measuring exercise by the amount that someone's heart pumps? How are we measuring health? Are we interested in cardiac health? Are we interested in how often someone gets sick? We can ask similar questions if we were interested in a question like, how is sleep related to focus? How are we defining sleep? Is it the number of hours that a person is getting in a night? Is it the amount of time that people spend in REM versus deep sleep? How are we defining focus? Is it the amount that we can pay attention to and solve math problems? Is it our ability to concentrate on Netflix at the end of the day? I'm really interested in the relationship between social media and mental health. I am not the only person interested in this question, of course. Researchers are becoming increasingly interested in this question. Policymakers are becoming increasingly interested in this question. Educators are becoming increasingly interested in this question. And I'm sure that the parents in the audience are becoming increasingly interested in this question as well. So many people have asked, how is social media related to well-being? And when we measure well-being by mental health outcomes, things like depression, things like anxiety, you might be somewhat surprised to hear that the literature here is extremely, extremely mixed. We're very unclear on the relationship between social media and mental health outcomes like depression and anxiety. So some scientists have found positive relationships, that social media leads to more, is associated with more depression, more anxiety. Some have found that social media is actually related to less depression, less anxiety. Some have found no association at all. It's really led me and many others to ask, okay, well then, what the heck is going on? What's the relationship between social media and well-being? And so early on, I kind of took a step back and said, well, why are we looking at these really complicated clinical mental health outcomes? Obviously, these are important, but what are we ultimately interested in here? What's sort of the core at what our question is? Now, I argue that the core of what our question is how does social media make people feel? When people are using social media, how does it emotionally impact them? How is social media use correlated with the amount that a person tends to feel positive versus negative emotions? And so that is the question that I came to graduate school with in August of 2019. This is Summers Family Hall. This is our home to psychological and brain sciences over at WashU. If you haven't explored the WashU campus, I'm sure many of you have. It's beautiful. Our building is beautiful. I spend a lot of time here. And I was talking to my academic advisor, Dr. Renee Thompson, saying, social media and emotion, this is what we should be studying. This is what people want to know about. And she said, great, that sounds awesome. Let's do it. Let's take it on. How are you going to measure social media? When you say social media, what do you mean? This became a huge, huge question that we spent more than a couple years working towards. And if you were paying attention earlier, you'll know that it's really, really important that we define our terms. So we have to get really specific about how we're measuring social media. So let me start by just very, very quickly telling you a little bit about how people have measured social media in the past. And I'm just going to briefly tell you why all of these ways of measuring social media are bad. So when social media was first coming to the stage, people were first starting to become interested in this question. Researchers were asking how much time is someone spending on these platforms? So time per day, frequency of use in a week, those were the types of questions that scientists were really interested in. And across the board, we were really finding mixed effects. It was very unstable relationships that were being found. More and more people started arguing, well, of course, we're finding mixed results. Time per day spent on these sites, frequency of use doesn't tell us about the actual ways in which people are using social media. So this is bad. Let's move away from it. Next up, people started looking at specific social media platforms. So started looking at our Instagram, our Facebook, and getting really, really specific about these specific platforms. A little slightly more consistent relationships being found overall in the field looking at this. Still, by and large, really mixed results. Things are still really unclear. And again, people are arguing, well, knowing that people are spending time on Facebook or Instagram, it still doesn't tell us anything about how people are actually using these platforms. So let's move away from that. Most recently in the field, people have started looking at what we call passive versus active social media use. Some of you in the audience may be familiar with these terms. And I think if you find yourself sitting here saying, I have kind of like a vague understanding of what passive social media use is, kind of a vague understanding of what active social media use is, I'm still not like super clear on what these constructs are, you're not alone. Researchers in the field are not super clear on what these constructs are, and that's a big part of the problem. Generally speaking, we kind of tend to think of active social media use as using social media to engage in direct communication, to form relationships with people, whereas passive social media use is thought of as being more about just like you're scrolling or consuming content. I'm sure that if you challenge yourselves, you will very easily find that there are many types of things on social media you can probably think of doing that really don't clearly fall into either active or passive social media use. And so that has been a primary argument in this area as well. And so passive versus active use, we want to move away from it. It's too broad. It's not as helpful as we hoped it would be. So, okay, what now do we do? And this became a big question. I'm gonna, like I said, kind of walk you through a little bit of what we did. I'm gonna take sort of a broad overarching picture here to walk you through how we decided to measure and define social media use. If you are interested in reading a fairly dry academic journal article about this, it is published. You're welcome to read it. I'm happy to chat more about it via email or after today's session. So quick bird's eye overview. What we did was we had about 200 college students use social media for 3 minutes at a time. Of course, college students are the folks who are using social media, the adult population that's using social media the most. And after those 3 minutes, we told them to tell us everything that they just did on social media in like agonizing detail. Like tell us every single little thing that you can remember doing. And we came up with a whole bunch of, really just rich responses from people where they told us exactly what it was that they are doing on social media. So I'll read an example to you here. I'm going to see if I can read it in little text over here. This person says, the only social media I use is Instagram. I generally interact with the platform as little as possible, except for supporting friends, my own accounts activity, and learning and gaining insight into accounts that interest me. During the 3 minutes, I did what I typically use Instagram for, which is to view, it's so small, view accounts and their subsequent portfolios. I never really like or comment on anything. I do save posts and catalog them for use, later. I didn't interact with any accounts of people I directly know. I just looked at a contemporary illustrative artist named James Jean. Okay, I think I got most of that. So you can see from accounts like this how we can extract just tons and tons of information about what people do. What I really appreciated about comments like this is that they also told us a little bit about what they don't do. So now we're also gaining insights into, just all sorts of activities that these college students have in mind when they're engaging on social media. So we spent some time going through every single one of these responses, and we just extracted, all of the individual activities that people report doing. So we had things, for example, like engaging with content that I find positive or that I morally or ethically agree with. I spent time engaging with content that I found negative or that I morally or ethically disagree with. So we tried to get really fine-grained in these specific social media activities. We wound up coming to a list of, I want to say, 45 discrete activities. Great. But what are we going to do with a list of 45 activities? Every time we want to know what someone's doing on social media, we're going to look at 45 different things. That seems unreasonable. Really, our goal here was to be able to categorize social media into patterns of use. What are sort of the general categories, the general ways in which people are using social media? So we did some fancy math that I'm not going to get into the weeds of, but outshot 4 different categories of social media use. That at the end of the day, our data were showing that social media activities can be grouped into 4 distinct patterns of social media. So I'm going to walk you through what each of those 4 different types of use are. We have identified comparison-based social media, consumption-based social media use, belief-based social media use, and image-based social media use. So consumption-based social media is all about using social media and consuming content. This is where we see people saying things like, I was catching up on the news, I was scrolling through my feed, I was looking at what my friends were up to, those sorts of activities. Comparison-based social media use is where we were seeing people say, like, I was comparing my body to other people's bodies. I was comparing my life or experiences to other people's lives or experiences. What was really interesting here was that one of the items that fell really strongly into this category was using social media and reminiscing about the past. So remembering that time I went on that vacation several years ago. It's funny to see college students do this, and they say things like, I was remembering my high school friends, all those many, 1 year ago. And so, really we think of this as using social media to compare yourself to your own past as well. Belief-based social media is all about using social media to really reinforce and express negative opinions, negative beliefs. This is where we see things like our doom scrolling, so people saying that they're going out of their way to engage with content that they find upsetting. This is also where we see things saying that they're disliking or commenting unsupportively on other people's social media content, those sorts of things. And then image-based social media use is using social media and creating or cultivating a positive social impression. So this is where we see things like people saying that they're making posts about something positive that's happened to them. They're looking at how many people have liked or commented on their content, those sorts of activities. So great. So now when we say we're interested in social media use and well-being, we know how we're defining social media. We're defining it by these 4 categories of use. And as a quick aside, I will say that we did develop this scale for use in college students. That was our sample for development. We have since administered this scale and tested this model of measuring social media in teenagers and 13 to 17-year-olds and in adults aged 25 to 65. And it works, is what I will say. This seems to be a good model of measuring social media across these age groups. So like I said, now we can go back to our original question and say, how are these 4 different types of social media related to the emotions that people experience? So we're researchers, we're scientists. We designed an experiment to test this question. So I'm going to walk you through it, kind of bird's eye view. What we did was we had about 400 people do experimental lab-based, they did it over Zoom technically, but we're going to call it a lab-based study, where they told us how they were feeling, to what extent they were experiencing positive and negative emotions. Then they used their own social media for a few minutes at a time in just one way. So we had taught them about the 4 different types of social media, and then we said, now only use it in this specific way. And then we asked them to report how much they experienced positive and negative emotion again. And they did this 4 times, once for each type of social media. And so for every person, we could see across the 4 different types of social media, how did their positive and negative emotions change? And so I'm going to walk you through what we found just to orient you to these graphs for a moment. We have a graph for each type of social media. You're going to see negative emotions plotted in a dotted line. You're going to see positive emotions plotted in more of like a dashed line. And what we're looking at is we're looking at emotion plotted before social media use to right after that type of social media. So we found that 2 types of social media use, image and consumption-based use, had the effect of increasing people's positive emotions and decreasing their negative emotions. So in other words, these 2 different types of social media made people feel better. We saw the exact opposite effect for belief and comparison-based social media. Unsurprisingly, I will say all of this was consistent with what we thought we were going to find. For these 2 types of use, we saw an increase in negative emotions and a decrease in positive emotions from before to after social media. So said another way, these types of social media made people feel worse. So we'll kind of quickly go through a summary of what we've talked about together so far. We know that consumption-based social media is consuming content on social media. It made people feel better in the moment. Comparison-based social media is comparing oneself to others or to one's own past on social media. It made people feel worse in the moment. Belief-based social media is using social media and reinforcing negative opinions. It made people feel worse in the moment. And image-based social media is using social media and creating a positive social image. It made people feel better in the moment. So what does this mean? You might be tempted to say, you know what, moving forward, venturing into my life, I'm only going to engage in consumption and image-based social media use. These are the types of social media that make people feel good. That's only what I'm going to do moving forward. I wouldn't say that that's entirely wrong. I wouldn't say that that's a bad way of thinking about it. I will add a caveat because nothing is that simple. Nothing is ever straightforward. And what I will say is that, remember this experimental paradigm where we, had people engage in each of their 4 types of social media, rate emotions before and after. What I didn't tell you is that we also had people report on the extent to which they tend to experience positive and negative emotions in their everyday lives. So we all vary in the extent to which we tend to feel negative emotions, the extent to which we tend to feel positive emotions. What we found was that although consumption and image-based social media made people feel better in the moment, it was actually associated with more negative emotionality. So people who were engaging in more consumption and image-based social media were also the people who report more negative emotionality in their everyday lives. Now, I will say we don't know anything about directionality here, and that's a really important caveat and something I really want to draw your attention to. So we could imagine a situation in which social media use leads to changes in well-being, but we can also imagine a world in which well-being leads to changes in how people use social media. And so just to take an example here, we can imagine how people may engage in consumption-based social media use, and perhaps too much engagement in this type of social media leads to more negative emotions on like kind of this, more regular weekly basis. We can also imagine a world in which people who experience more negative emotions might be more likely to use consumption-based social media because it makes them feel better. We don't know, as of this point in time, what the directionality is. I will say that assuming the latter, this would point to people using social media as a form of emotion regulation. And this is something that the field is getting increasingly interested in. How is it that people are using social media in order to manage their emotions? So some conclusions for today. I hope you take away that social media can be thought of as falling into 4 different patterns of social media use. Some types of social media make people feel better in the moment. Some types of social media seem to make people feel worse. With that in mind, social media cannot be thought of as being all good or all bad. And social media might, maybe, the jury's still out, be a really effective tool for emotion regulation, for people actually managing their emotions intentionally. I encourage you to ask yourselves, what are the types of social media that you tend to engage in? What are sort of your social media patterns that you default to? How does social media make you feel? Do you think that you're using social media in order to manage your emotions? And how do my family and my friends use social media? And it's really fun. Once you start identifying these patterns of social media use in your friends and family, you can tell them about it. And you can tell them about what that might mean for their emotional experiences. And people really, really like that when you diagnose their social media use. I continue to ask myself, what do my therapy clients need to know? Something that I didn't mention earlier is that I am a student therapist over at Washington University. I do see therapy clients, and it's remarkably common that people come into the therapy room and they say things to me like, Allison, I was on Instagram for 3 hours yesterday. Help me. There's always sort of that sense of panic, I think, for folks associated with their social media use. And my approach, especially after doing this research, has always been to say, okay, well, let's not panic. How were you using social media? What were some of the patterns you were engaging in? How do you think your social media use was making you feel over those 3 hours? Do you think you were trying to regulate your emotions? And so these are some of the questions that we can explore in the therapy room to really help our clients develop these healthier habits, identify and catch maybe some negative habits. I think these findings have some really important clinical implications. Of course, I can continue to ask myself, what do policymakers need to know? I was at a conference in DC a couple months ago, and this was really the forefront of the conversation. And knowing that social media maybe isn't all good or all bad, knowing that there are different patterns of social media that exist, well, how might that help policymakers? How might that help educators? And of course, I always continue to ask myself, what's next? And I'm really excited to say that we have a lot on the horizon in this program of research. Something that we are just starting up in the lab that I'm particularly excited about is utilizing what we call ecological momentary assessment methodology, or EMA. Essentially what we do here is that we ask people for a week to report to us on their cell phones several times a day. How are you just using social media? How do you feel? Were you using social media to regulate your emotions? And we get a much more fine-grained image of, okay, when people say that they're feeling a certain way at time A, how does that relate to how they say they've used social media at time B? When people say that they feel a certain way at time B, how does that relate to how they just use social media at time A? So we can start getting, a more fine-grained look here. We are moving this program of research largely to an adolescent sample, so looking at social media use within 13 to 17-year-olds. Of course, this is the population that's really using social media the most and who might be sort of most susceptible to its effects. This is a real time of development in the human lifespan. Something that we're really interested in with regard to teenagers and social media use is the extent to which social media might actually be a really helpful tool for identity development. And so if we think of the adolescent period as being a time when people are engaging in sort of this healthy, normative, who am I? How do I compare to my peers? Social media may be a really helpful tool in that endeavor. But of course, adolescents might also be at particular risk of some of the activities associated with social media use. So really trying to dive deeper into this idea of social media as being a double-edged sword. Like I sort of alluded to earlier, we're starting to really get specific about this question of how are different types of social media used as a tool for people to manage their emotions. And something we're moving into as well is considering some more biological indicators. So still asking people, to what extent do you feel positive emotions? To what extent do you feel negative emotions? But also looking at things like heart rate, looking at things like respiration, and really getting a sense of how much the body is activated when people are engaged in these 4 different types of use, which we think is going to tell us a little bit more about the effects of these types of use in real time as well. I will put a plug in here that we are actively recruiting 13 to 17-year-olds into these social media studies. So if you have a 13 to 17-year-old, if you know a 13 to 17-year-old, please do send them our way. If you scan this QR code, it will take you to a screening survey to see if you're eligible for these studies. I'll have this up on the last slide as well. And ultimately, the question that I just always continue to ask myself is, how can we help people develop healthy social media use habits? Ultimately, that is at the core of my interest in this area, and it's what I really hope to devote my career to understanding if I'm so lucky. So I'd like to thank my academic advisor, Dr. Renee Thompson, who is also my co-author on all of this work. I would like to thank the funding agencies at Washington University who gave us money to do this research, so that was really nice. And I would like to thank my team of research assistants over in our emotion and mental health lab at WashU. These are the people who have, boots on the ground, who are running the sessions, who are calling participants back, who are really making the study happen. I could not do this work without them. So with that, I'm happy to take questions if we have time for that today. I'm also happy to answer questions after today's platform. I'll be kind of hanging around. But like I mentioned, if you are interested in participating in any of this research, please do scan the QR code, or you can always email our team at teenmedia@woostel.edu. I'm also very happy to answer questions via email. My personal email is at the bottom here as well. And I'll leave you with that. Do you have time for questions, or should I?
Downstairs. Can I close this? So I've had conversations about my partner's social media use, and that never goes well. She doesn't listen to me. I'm sure none of